Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Moria Omer Atali, and I'm a PhD student in the CHIRP program. Thank you all for being here and for your participation today over the last two sessions. Over this course of this conference, we've heard powerful testimonies, shared innovative research, and wondered about actionable solutions. As we come to the final session, we would like to offer some cure and some hope. In this closing session for today, we will start with a lecture by Professor Suzanne Friedman, who will join us through Zoom all the way from Iowa. The lecture title is Forgiveness Education for Children Resilience Building in Times of Crisis. Following that will be comments by Dr. Yonat Rom, and we will conclude with your comments and questions for both Professor Friedman and Dr. Rom. I would like to start by introducing our speakers. Suzanne Friedman is a professor of human development in the Educational Psychology Foundation and Leadership Studies Department at the University of Northern Iowa. She was the recipient of the APA Dissertation Award in 1993 for a groundbreaking research on forgiveness and incest survivors, published in 1996 in the Journal of Counseling and Clinical Psychology. Suzanne has been studying the topic of forgiveness for over 30 years, and her publications focus on psychology of interpersonal forgiveness and forgiveness education with children, adolescents, and adults. She has presented at numerous national and international conferences on the psychology of interpersonal forgiveness. Suzanne Friedman is a contributing writer and researcher for the International Forgiveness Institute. She was also a member of the Discover Forgiveness Scientific Advisory Council for the Templeton Word Charity Foundation. Suzanne Friedman is the author of the curriculum The Courage to Forgive, educating elementary school children about forgiveness. The comments on Suzanne's lecture will be given by Dr. Yonat Rom. Yonat, hi. Dr. Rom is a lecturer at the Seymour Fox School of Education at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Her main areas of research and teaching include social interaction and relationships between people with disabilities and typically developing people in the family, educational settings, and other social contexts, with a particular focus on empathy. Dr. Rom completed her PhD at Tel Aviv University and is an alumna of the Israeli Fellows Program. She was a postdoctoral fellow at the Hebrew University Psychology Department and at the Autism Research Center at the University of Cambridge, with which she currently collaborates on the study of empathy toward autistic people. Dr. Rom is also the head of the Mixed Social Interactions Lab at the Hebrew University. Okay, without further ado, I'm honored to have Professor Friedman here with us today. Please welcome Professor Suzanne Friedman.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be part of this conference and presenting today to you on forgiveness and forgiveness education. I will start off my presentation by introducing the concept of forgiveness and defining what it is and what it's not. Forgiveness education study that I conducted with fifth graders, and hopefully I will be able to do all of that in my allotted time. So you may have to forgive me if I don't get through all my slides, and I am hoping that you will get a copy of this PowerPoint. I like to start off my presentation with a quote. We reenact our past everywhere, at home, at school, at the workplace, on the playground, in the streets. We cue each other to play roles in our personal dramas, secretly hoping that someone will give us a different script, a different outcome to the drama. And I like to think that forgiveness can be the different script. Forgiveness is talked about widely, but what forgiveness means and looks like is not often discussed or shared. Children are encouraged to forgive, but they don't really know what it means or looks like to forgive. Some questions that you can reflect on when I'm speaking today is where and how do children and adolescents learn about forgiveness? What are the benefits of including forgiveness education in the school curriculum? What does forgiveness education look like for students? And how does learning about forgiveness and how to forgive build students' resilience during times of crisis? The current mental health of children is not good. Aside from crisis and trauma, recent statistics illustrate increased anxiety, depression, and anger in elementary school. According to leading experts in pediatric health, the mental health crisis among children has become a national emergency. And according to Shivaram, we are caring for young people with soaring rates of depression, anxiety, trauma, loneliness, suicidality that will have lasting impacts on them. Forgiveness education is currently being investigated as an approach to decreasing anger, managing emotions, and increasing psychological well-being and positive interpersonal relations. Previous research indicates that anger reduction is one of the most crucial elements and greatest benefits of forgiveness. Children with high levels of anger are more likely to show aggression, seek mental health treatment, and experience academic and social difficulties. How forgiveness builds resilience. Resilience develops and thrives in the face of adversity. In recent years, researchers and educators have increasingly recognized the transformative role of forgiveness education in fostering resilience among individuals of all ages. At its core, forgiveness education encourages individuals to release feelings of anger, resentment, and bitterness towards themselves and others, thereby freeing themselves from the emotional burdens that hinder their growth and well-being. By teaching individuals to acknowledge their pain, process their emotions, and extend compassion to themselves and others, forgiveness education lays the foundation for resilience in the face of life's challenges. This is our definition of forgiveness. It's a bit of a mouthful, and I want to emphasize two important points after I read the whole definition. When unjustly hurt by another, we forgive when we overcome the resentment toward the offender, not by denying our right to resentment, but instead by trying to offer the wrongdoer compassion, benevolence, sometimes love. As we give these, we as forgivers realize that the offender does not necessarily have a right to or deserve such gifts. Well, three important points. We talk about forgiveness in the context of deep, personal, and unfair hurt. So I'm not talking about forgiveness as please forgive me for being 5 minutes late, or please forgive me for stepping on your toe. I would prefer to say please excuse me in those contexts. So when I'm talking about forgiveness, I'm talking about it for deep and unfair hurt. Another important point is that we don't deny our right to resentment. Forgiveness is sometimes criticized because people don't think that the role of anger and resentment is important in the model. But we recognize that we have a right to our resentment based on the hurt we experienced. But we as forgivers realize, but we give it up during the process of forgiveness. Sorry about that. The third point is that we recognize the offender doesn't necessarily have a right to our forgiveness based on their actions, but we give it to them anyway. A definition more easily understood and applied is that forgiveness is a decrease in negative thoughts, feelings, and behaviors directed at an offender, and over time, you may develop more positive thoughts, feelings, and behaviors towards the offender. We have to remember that forgiveness is a moral virtue. It's more than just letting go of our anger. Our thoughts and feelings about the offender change. When we forgive, we recognize the offender's humanity. I like to use the example that I could be mad at my husband and I'm a runner and I can go out running and I could feel better. I got some endorphins out. I'm not as angry. But that doesn't mean that I've forgiven, because my feelings and thoughts towards my husband might not have changed as a result of my run. When we forgive, we take the other person into consideration. A little bit later, I'll explain this in more detail. But forgiveness allows us to see the inherent worth in all human beings. And we recognize that doing a bad thing does not make someone a bad person, with some caveats. When I work with fifth graders, we talk about how many bad things can a person do, maybe before we would say that they're a bad person. But no one wants to be remembered for their worst action. We have all made mistakes and hurt others. And it's important to realize that forgiveness takes time and is not a shortcut to healing. Sometimes we are given messages in society that we need to forgive right away. And based on the severity of the hurt one experienced, forgiveness can take quite a while. It's important that we recognize that the need for social emotional learning is increasing. According to a 2021 SEL report, 87% of parents say SEL is important in helping children's emotional well-being. In a 2018 US survey of current and recent high school students and alumni both reported that they wanted more social emotional skill development and that they expect their school to help them develop social and emotionally. 85% of school counselors surveyed stated that they were very interested in incorporating SEL into their school counseling, and 91% stated that they would benefit from additional resources and professional development. Forgiveness education can be both a form of social emotional learning or character education or peace education. And college students in my interpersonal forgiveness class frequently comment that they would have benefited from learning about forgiveness earlier in life. So forgiveness education and research has occurred with a variety of populations of children and adolescents. This is just a sampling of some of the research. There's been research studies done with parentally love-deprived college students. One of the first forgiveness education studies took place in Brooklyn, New York by Hepdex in 1996. She worked with inner city fifth graders. Gambaro worked with angry adolescents in 2002. Arab Sheckman worked with adolescents in Israel. I did worked with at-risk adolescents and attending an alternative school in Iowa in 2018. Professor Enright worked with first and third grade students in Belfast, Northern Ireland, in Milwaukee, and Madison, Wisconsin. I also did a research study with fifth graders in a small Midwestern community. Previous research includes both universal school-based group interventions, such as SEL education or developmental guidance programs, and individual or small group interventions that occurred outside the school day and targeted specific populations. Studies have shown that forgiveness education is associated with increased forgiveness, willingness to forgive, hope and life satisfaction, decreased anger and depression, and improved academics, cooperation, and psychological well-being. Rapp et al. In 2022 conducted a meta-analysis exploring the impact of forgiveness education in 20 intervention programs with children and adolescents. And the results highlight the benefit of forgiveness education for a variety of youth around the world, illustrated in decreased anger and increased forgiveness across the studies. To help flesh out the definition of forgiveness that I gave a few minutes ago, I want to just briefly discuss some general guidelines about forgiveness. So, forgiveness is always a choice. It may not be for everyone. It's perfectly acceptable for someone to choose not to forgive. When I was in graduate school, I was doing a forgiveness education intervention, and one of my good friends said, "You do the forgiveness education, I'll do the revenge group. Let's see who gets more participants." However, we don't want youth to choose not to forgive because of misconceptions surrounding forgiveness or lack of education. As I said, the college students that I work with frequently say that learning about forgiveness would have helped them when they were younger. They wish they would have had it in their school curriculum. Interpersonal forgiveness is between people, not between a person and an inanimate object. We don't talk about forgiving institutions. We have to find someone specific in an institution to forgive. We don't talk about forgiving tornadoes. We talk about forgiving individuals. As I said, forgiveness is a choice that one makes for themselves. It takes time and effort. We have to be careful when we bring up the topic of forgiveness. We don't want people to be introduced or asked to forgive too soon before they have had time to get over their shock, perhaps, or their normal and natural reaction to experiencing a deep hurt. Forgiveness follows a deep personal and unfair hurt. It could be psychological, emotional, physical, or moral. When one begins the forgiveness process, they may not feel like forgiving, but an attitude of forgiveness may be facilitated by the beginning steps in the process. One of the first signs that forgiveness is occurring is that the person no longer seeks retaliation, is maybe stop their revenge fantasies. A common misconception of forgiveness that I often hear is that a person is not going to forgive unless they receive an apology from the offender. And that leaves the person trapped, and it leaves their healing in the control of the offender who hurt them already. We don't want to make our healing dependent on someone else's apology. The problem with that is many times the offender does not apologize, does not recognize their wrongdoing. So we can forgive without any response from the wrongdoer. Of course, apologies make forgiveness easier, but they don't have to occur for us to forgive. And I'll talk about that a little bit more when I talk about the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. Another misconception is that we often feel that when we receive an apology, we automatically have to forgive. And that's not true either. And we do a little bit of forcing apologies and forgiveness on children and adolescents when they're young. I'll talk more about that as well. The offender doesn't need to have intended the wrong for a context of forgiveness. Intent is not necessary to forgive. The process of forgiveness is not natural. It's not our first instinct. The person may make the choice to forgive on their own, but they may require the help of another person, the support of a counselor, an educator, and this is especially true for elementary school students. Difficulty in arriving at a forgiveness solution varies with external variables, such as the severity of the injury, the quality of the relationship prior to injury, time since injury, and a person's ability to understand forgiveness. I often ask my students if they think it's easier to forgive someone that they know, someone that they're in a close personal relationship with, or a student, or a stranger. And their answer varies. People they know, they have good memories, they have positive characteristics, but they also didn't expect that person to hurt them so deeply. A stranger they may not have had any expectations of, but they might not know anything about that person. Forgiveness can be transforming for self, others, and communities. I taught a forgiveness education class in an alternative school a few years ago, and one of the students' comments illustrates the benefits of forgiveness to the forgiver. She said, "When I forgave this person for the things they did to me, it felt like weights coming off my shoulders. I felt like a completely different person. I tell my friends to forgive instead of holding grudges because everyone is human and humans make mistakes. That helped me forgive someone I have been fighting with for years. Misconceptions of forgiveness can keep people from choosing to forgive. And that's why forgiveness education is so important. It's also important to talk about what forgiveness is not. Forgiveness is not the same as pardoning. We're not letting someone off the hook when we forgive. A quote from a graduate student that I taught that was in my interpersonal forgiveness class illustrates this. She said, I used to think that forgiving someone who does wrong lets them off the hook. I viewed forgiveness as a sign of weakness. And now I realize that holding a grudge makes one weak, not strong. An important point that I want people to understand is that forgiveness does not mean automatic reconciliation. Forgiveness can lead to reconciliation, but it doesn't have to. Some situations, an individual who has been deeply hurt does not want to reconcile with the person who hurt them, or it may not be possible. They might not be in contact with the offender. The offender may have moved away. The offender may have passed away. The offender may not be safe to be around. So in an ongoing abusive or hurtful relationship, the first thing is we want is the person to be safe and out of harm's way if possible. And then we could bring up the idea of forgiveness, but we would not expect someone to stay in a relationship where they are being re-injured. Forgiveness does not mean we condone what happened or excuse. When we forgive, we are recognizing that we have been deeply hurt. We are naming the hurt and identifying it. Forgiveness is not denial or indifference. And even though we hear the popular phrase, forgive and forget, forgiveness does not mean forgetting. When we forgive, we may not think about the injury as much or with as much intensity of anger and resentment, but we don't forget our deep hurt. And as I said before, forgiveness is not simply a diminishing of angry feelings over time. And forgiveness is not an exclusive self-centering. It's more than a self-help strategy. When I forgive, I do gradually begin to hope the other person changes. I may wish the offender well, even though I might not be in a relationship with that person. This quote from a fifth grader in my forgiveness education study illustrates some of the concepts I've just mentioned. He states, I've learned that anger is a natural feeling. It takes time to forgive. You don't have to forgive right away. They don't always apologize. Forgiveness is one step closer to healing. When you forgive, you can put it in the past. You don't have to be friends with the offender after. Apologies make forgiving easier. Forgiveness is made by the person who was hurt. If you want revenge, then you haven't forgiven in your heart. Why individuals don't forgive? Too much pain. The first part of our forgiveness model, one has to work through their pain and uncomfortable feelings. The hurt may be too recent. Individuals might not know or think about forgiveness as an option. And that speaks to the question, when do we teach individuals about forgiveness? Forgiveness is often misunderstood with other concepts. One's immediate environment is not supportive of forgiveness. If students are hearing negative messages about forgiveness from their family and friends and educators, they might not be willing to forgive. Forgiveness is hard work. One's cultural conditioning may not be supportive of forgiveness. Their pride may get in their way. Change is difficult, and forgiveness is often viewed as weakness. We developed a 20-unit model of forgiveness, and that includes 4 different phases. The model is flexible. You can go back and rework certain steps. Certain steps in the model may not apply to every individual. It's important that we recognize that forgiveness cannot be rushed. Everybody will go through the model on their own timeline. The decision to forgive may be motivated initially out of self-interest because the person wants to feel better. They want to get rid of their anger and resentment. And after a period of time, the forgiver will focus more on the offender than the self. Sorry for that typo. By encouraging individuals to explore their emotions and develop healthy coping mechanisms, forgiveness education equips students with the emotional skills needed to navigate life's deepest hurts. Forgiveness allows individuals to regulate their feelings, develop perspective, and respond to challenges with clarity and composure. Students who know that they can handle their most painful and uncomfortable feelings develop resiliency. Researchers and educators have increasingly recognized the transformative role of forgiveness education in fostering resilience among individuals of all ages. So the first phase in our forgiveness education model is the uncovering phase. And that's really when we break down the psychological defenses, we deal with our anger, we come to grips with shame and guilt. We compare ourselves with the offender and realize they may be suffering as well. We recognize that life is not fair. And this is, the focus is on children at this point is on identifying and expressing feelings during the uncovering phase. So acknowledging that one is hurt takes strength and courage. We accept that emotions are not good or bad. All emotions are natural. We teach kids to sit with their emotions. The decision phase is the willingness to consider forgiveness as an option, and we make the commitment to forgive the offender. The work phase is really where the work of forgiveness occurs. We reframe or rethink who the other person is. We develop empathy, compassion. We accept and absorb the pain so we don't pass it on to others. The deepening phase is we find meaning for self and others in the forgiveness process. We recognize that we have needed others' forgiveness, that we're not alone. And then the last part of forgiveness is we experience an internal emotional release. Helping children and adolescents forgive, we have to recognize that the child may not forgive the same way we do, that children understand that they don't have to reconcile with someone who had hurt them. And we need to educate children and encourage them to forgive. Children need to know that there's a difference between revenge and justice. So lots of kids think that when they forgive, that the offender won't be held accountable. Forgiveness is personal and justice is public. So the person who hurt them will experience consequences. In my study of forgiveness, I worked with fifth graders. I did a single group pre-test, post-test design. I taught the forgiveness education in 10 40-minute lessons. All students received the forgiveness education, even though only the students with parental consent participated in the forgiveness research. I used children's literature, and the curriculum was expanded and developed into the curriculum that I developed. We dealt with feelings and positive and negative ways of expressing anger. We talked about the advantages and disadvantages. Students were asked to draw pictures of themselves when they were feeling hurt and angry. Students were validated for holding on to their anger. I asked students what they did when they were angry. We read various books that dealt with anger. I'm not going to read this. Just it's important to recognize that if we get a scrape and don't pay attention to it, it will turn into an infection. And this is the same thing with feelings of anger and hurt. They don't just disappear. If we don't help children deal with their anger and hurt, it will fester and turn into more violence, more revengeful behavior. In terms of helping students forgive, we talked about radical kindness and We talked about how it's easy to show kindness to other people who are kind to us, but not necessarily easy to show kindness to students or other people who don't show kindness. We asked students to decide to do something different about their anger. And one thing, it's powerful for students to know that it's their choice in how they respond to the hurtful situation or conflict. So they might not have had control over what happened to them and the way they were hurt, but they get a choice in how they respond. And without a sense of control, it's hard to feel hopeful. And without hope, students may experience anxiety and depression. I'm just going to jump to my results quickly if I could. We talked about kindness. We asked students to recognize the worth of the other person. And that means that they see their offender's humanity and they believe that they are more than their hurtful act. They're not just the monster who hurt us. I gave them magic sunglasses to help them expand their view of the person who hurt them. The different books helped us realize why someone might have done something. They reframed the actions of the individual. Understanding the person in context allowed them to develop empathy and compassion towards the offender, led to a feeling of peace. We talked about forgiving as fitting with the type of person that they wanted to be: generous, kind, and loving, less angry, more peaceful. It doesn't mean automatic reconciliation. The assessments that I used to assess changes was the Enright Forgiveness Inventory for Children, the Conceptual Forgiveness Questionnaire, which assessed children's knowledge and understanding, the Beck Inventory, Anger Inventory, and a 5-item written questionnaire. Children were hurt by family members, friends, classmates. The types of hurts they experienced were teasing, name-calling, physical and verbal aggression, being yelled at, lied to, treated rudely. And the results: students experienced significantly greater increases in their forgiveness toward a specific offender from pre-test to post-test. They also illustrated statistically significant increase in their knowledge of understanding of forgiveness, as measured by the 13-item conceptual forgiveness questionnaire. We did not find any significant differences in students' level of anger from pre-test to post-test, although it was trending in the right direction. However, at the pre-test, the Bani scores were all in the average range, so they weren't increased, so there wasn't a lot of room for them to change. The last slide is students learned more about when we asked them individually what they learned and enjoyed about the forgiveness education, they reported that they learned more about what forgiveness means and involved. 21 students said that. How to forgive someone, 14 students reported that. That anger is a natural feeling and how to calm down, 13 out of 30 students reported that. Effects of being nice and showing kindness to others, 10 students. They learned from and enjoyed the books, 9 students reported that. More about bullying, 8 students said that. We are all the same underneath, reflecting that they recognize the common humanity, 6 students. And perspective taking and empathy, 6 students also reported that. There were certain limitations. I didn't have a control group. All measures were self-report. I wasn't able to do follow-up assessments because of time limitations. I was the forgiveness educator. Future research might also want to include classroom teachers to ensure that educator characteristics, expertise, and expectations do not impact results. In conclusion, learning about forgiveness when young gives students the knowledge and power needed to ask for or grant forgiveness, as well as choose empathy, kindness, and compassion over anger and resentment. School is one of the most powerful socialization forces and a very supportive environment to learn about forgiveness. This study illustrated that it is possible to teach 5th grade students about forgiveness with favorable results. Children's literature helps students learn better and understand the definition and process of forgiveness. We definitely need more research with students from different grades, geographical locations, and cultures using active and waitlist control groups. Future research can compare this forgiveness education curriculum to other curriculums, including forgiveness education for parents is recommended, as this can reinforce student learning. 50% of the students reported hearing and learning about forgiveness from their parents. As important as it is to demonstrate forgiveness to students, it is equally important to provide counselors and educators specific information on how forgiveness education can be infused into the curriculum and the benefits of doing so. Promoting forgiveness as a virtue to students can reward the forgiver, the forgiven, and society at large. Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to go over time.
Thank you very, very much,
Thank you.
Professor Friedman. That was fascinating. We will quickly move forward to hear the comments by Dr. Yonapom.
Hi. So thanks for all of you who stayed till the end. And thank you, Susan, for a thought-provoking talk and work. And I want to use a quote you used actually in one of your papers. I don't know if you remember. If you want real peace in the world, start with the children. And I thought that might be a good ending for the day and an opening for my talk today, my comments on your talk, Susan. What am I going to talk about? I'll say a few comments about how did Professor Friedman's work make me think more about empathy, what I usually do quite a lot. What is empathy? What did I learn from children with disabilities and their siblings about empathy? The bidirectional nature of empathy. And can we also talk about the bidirectional nature of forgiveness? So we see that the process of forgiveness requires the perspective taking of the other. And this is the fundamental building block of empathy. Sometimes we intuitively and spontaneously do it, even daily. But if it becomes a lot harder to take the perspective of the one who hurt us, as well as it is to take the perspective of someone who is very different than us. And it was interesting to see that children, even children in your study, that you brought some of the quotes and others, you are really recommended to read the paper. So children intuitively realize that and express that in their comments, as shown in some of the quotes you presented and others. Sometimes we use the word empathy to refer to a sort of general trait or state of care or kindness. But when we talk about empathy in research, we refer to a multifaceted concept composed of cognitive empathy, emotional empathy, and a motivational empathy. So to have this full empathy thing, we need to understand, to recognize and understand the other's feelings, also to feel something similar, to have a sort of experience sharing, and also to have a sort of intention towards the other. This does not necessarily require the behavior itself, but a sort of sympathy or empathic concern. So, sorry, I had something else to say about it in regards to what you presented, Susan, about forgiveness. I think when I was reading your work and also listening today, that the process of forgiveness, it seems to be more related to the cognitive aspect of empathy, right? So more of perspective taking, understanding the other. Mm-hmm. And that made me think of the role of mutual interaction in this process of forgiveness. For example, the quote we will see again in a minute of one of the children that you mentioned as well about the fact that apologies makes forgiveness easier. And I was thinking to myself, why is it? Why is it that apology makes forgiveness easier? And one of the explanations I offer is that maybe the action of apology activates in a way also the emotional and motivational aspects of empathy. So in that sense, we have a fuller experience of empathy, broader than just the perspective taking itself. So in this moment of someone approaching to us and share something of their feelings or their mental state, it activates the full mechanism of empathy, and it brings into the process also the emotional aspect. And I will offer in a minute another explanation as well. So the offender does not need to apologize to the injured person to forgive. And receiving an apology does not mean one has to forgive. But when we do receive an apology, forgiveness becomes easier. It's not just the cognitive aspect that is in work, but also an emotional aspect that is activated from the mutual interaction. So another note about what I learned from children with disabilities and their siblings about empathy, and it will come together in a few moments and you'll understand why I mentioned this as well. So I have been studying sibling interactions and relationships in families in which one of the siblings is autistic for many years. And these children I was interviewing, observing, studying using questionnaires and experimental tasks taught me very important things. Some of them I will share with you today to make a very long story very, very short. The first is that children with disabilities, for example, autistic children, benefit from the social interactions with their siblings in terms of interpersonal social communication skills. But also, their siblings, the typically developing siblings, apparently grow up to be individuals with higher empathic abilities compared to the general population, yeah? Specifically, we see that when we measure cognitive empathy. So what is it that enhances empathy when you grow up with a sibling with disability? One explanation I offer is the constant training of this muscle of taking the perspective and figuring out mental states and emotions of someone who is different enough than you, that have a different experience and perception of the world. And that brings me to the bidirectional nature of empathy. So we don't have in empathy, as well as in forgiveness, we don't have to have the empathy of the other to empathize with them, right? But empathy is a bidirectional process in the sense that it is harder for us to empathize with those that we don't understand. Those who are less expressive, for example, who are very different than us, like we said. So it makes it easier for us if the target of empathy gives us a clue, like a glimpse into their mental world, into their feelings. And in that sense, it is a bidirectional process. In the field of autism research, for example, the difficulties of autistic people in cognitive empathy were studied and still are studied extensively. And it was offered as an explanation for their social difficulties, for their social communicational difficulties. But recently, there's a new theory and framework that really shakes the world of autism research and empathy research. That is the double empathy problem theory, offered first by Damian Milton here in the picture. And the double empathy problem theory offers a different framework to look at the origin of social communicational difficulties in autism, in saying that this process is, again, bidirectional. In simple words, it's not only that autistic people struggle with empathy, specifically with cognitive empathy, we, non-autistic people or typical people, also struggle to understand their emotions and feelings and mental states. So the breakdowns in the social communication are mutual. And we can apply this theory very intuitively above and beyond disabilities in general. When people with very different experiences of the world interact with one another, they will struggle to empathize with each other. And this theoretical framework yielded tons of research recently, including research that I'm working on. And it really is a mind-opening framework. But it's also quite depressing. So if that's the case, so are we destined to just never empathize with each other, not understanding each other? And I was thinking about that a lot and when I delved into the study of empathy and autism and this framework, and then I remembered my studies about siblings. And I thought, no, it doesn't have to be that way. So mixed neurotype interactions or social interactions with someone that his perception of the world, his experience or their experience of the world are so different can include empathy in the interactions. And in some cases, for example, in sibling interactions, might also include enhanced empathy. So this is something that I am working about these days, developing a sort of model, hopefully evidence-based, for the double empathy solution, we might say, that mainly build on the bidirectional nature of empathy. So we know that empathy, I was trying to convince you that empathy is not a one-way street, but involves mutual understanding. Can we also talk about, that's a question, yeah? A study of forgiveness is new to me. And I was thinking, can we also talk about the bidirectional nature of forgiveness? So I'm coming back to this child's quote that you, Professor Friedman, offered before. And I offered you that maybe what happens that makes apology easier and make forgiveness easier if someone apologizes. And I offered the activation of the emotional component. But now under the framework of the double empathy problem, I would like to say that it also helps us cognitively to understand the other. So that might be the case, that we also get a clue, a glimpse into the other's world, and we can understand them better. And this might be a lesson we learn from forgiveness and empathy research. Taking the perspective of the other is a muscle. We can, to some degree, train to become better at it. Also, empathy as well as forgiveness can be something we experience on our own. It seems that reciprocity makes it easier and better. And we also know that these interactive processes face many challenges when we need to take the perspective of someone very different from us or that has a very different approach to the situation. Like someone who hurt us is very different than us in the approach to the specific situation. But it is possible. And it helps us even to become better in empathy and better in forgiveness. So if we come back to the beginning of how important it is to start with the children, I think children have this time of practice. They also maybe need our help in directing them to the right ways of practicing this muscle. And this is an opportunity for me also to say thank you to the center and to the program and Tali and all members of the program for supporting my new research about understanding and promoting empathy towards children with disabilities. If you're interested and want to hear more, offer comments, so please find me today, tomorrow, or email me. And thank you again for this important day. Thank you again, Professor Friedman, for the thought-provoking talk and the ray of hope you offer us in your work, especially in these difficult times.
Thank you, Yonat. I think this framing and focus on empathy really adds and clarifies the idea of forgiveness. That was very, very interesting. We're moving. Okay. So then we're just trying to make sure we can see you. We are moving to the last part of this session, to the Q&A part. So if anyone has a question to ask, a comment to share, that will be the time.
Violence and okay. Suzanne, did you hear me or not? Shall I repeat?
Yes.
Okay.
I got
so
you.
Thank you so much for
Thank you for having me.
for bringing all us to such a crucial and important topic, especially in the times of full of violence and hateness that we are living now in. But my question, we all know that hateness is absolutely destructive, so it's really crucial to develop such a kind of a positive and forgiveness skills, if I may use this expression. But my question is, when educating children, when developing this forgiveness in education, I think it's equally important to work with parents because too often, I'm very sorry to say that, too often problems come from parents. And it may not be such an easy task to educate parents. So did you somehow work in this area? And if yes, what are your results? Yeah. And if I may, a very quick and very personal question. You said that one of your topics was that forgiveness is not forgetting. But
yes,
isn't it that if we didn't forget, we didn't forgive? Thank you so much.
Oh, that's a great question. And that's a common misconception. I'll do the forgiveness, forgetting. So I worked for my dissertation with incest survivors, one of the deepest hurts a person can experience. And I educated them about our forgiveness model. I worked with these women for an average in individual sessions for 14.3 months, so over a year. And most of the women were able to forgive, but they will never forget that they were sexually abused by a close relative, someone in their family. So they could forgive. They're not going to think about it as much or with as much anger. I'll just use myself as an example. I have a best friend. She once hurt me. I have forgiven her. We get together. We have great times. I love her. But I haven't forgotten about the hurt. I don't think about it as often. I don't think about it with anger and intensity. Now, I was teaching high school students last week, and I said it would be wonderful if we could forget the hurt, if they're like an amnesia could take us over, and with forgiving or with even without forgiving, that we were able to forget. But I don't think so. I don't think we forget. I don't think that's to me, The other question about involving parents, I think that is excellent point, and I really think it's important. I taught at-risk adolescents at an alternative school several years back, and I gave them the book Forgiveness is a Choice by Robert Enright. And these students were in high school and they weren't doing a lot of homework. They brought the book home, and what they reported to me is that their parents were interested in learning about forgiveness. And I think there are so many adults who don't truly understand what forgiveness is and isn't, and what it means and looks like to forgive, and why forgiveness is important. And I do think that when we educate students in school about forgiveness, that there should be a parent group as well. The at-risk adolescents also told me that they heard the message from their parents: don't start with anybody, but if someone starts with you, you make sure you get back. So they were being encouraged to seek revenge on people who had hurt them, rather than forgive. So I do agree that we need to do more to educate parents in many different areas, and forgiveness is one of those areas. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. There's another question, Suzanne.
Hi, thank you both very much. We needed to be uplifted a bit at the end of this day, so thank you. My question is for Suzanne. I'm a sociologist, so I saw you mention that culture also can shape how, if not, people are willing to forgive. And you said that there was also research around the world, so I wonder how forgiveness education looks or affects in conflict-ridden societies like ours. This feels... Yes, if you have something uplifting to say about that, that would be great.
Yeah, and in a conflict-ridden society and culture, students are definitely getting messages from others. And when we talk about forgiveness, it doesn't necessarily have to be related to the larger culture, perhaps the larger conflict, but it can be modeled in the family, in more personal relationships. When there's trauma and crisis going on in the larger society, people may be more stressed, more likely to take out their anger and stress and anxiety and worry on the people that they're most close to, their family and friends. Their nerves are on edge. They're not themselves. They're reacting maybe, angrier than they normally would. So modeling that forgiveness within the family, even just as a parent, I could be upset about something at my work or with a friend, and I could take it out on my children. And then just coming back later and saying, hey, I'm sorry I spoke to you harshly. You didn't deserve that. Or I reacted too strongly. I hope you can forgive me when you're ready. I just want to apologize. So I think that showing forgiveness at a smaller level can help students learn maybe later on how to forgive more deeper and perhaps larger issues. I don't know if that makes sense and answered your question.
I can add another point to your question and the answer coming again from the world of empathy research, that we talk strongly, I'm less familiar with forgiveness, but maybe it's similar. We talk strongly about the individual effect. So it's very, very hard to empathize with a group, especially with the out group as a collective. But something in the interpersonal connection, individual with another individuals, activates something very intuitive and spontaneous in empathy. So maybe the answer for your question, it's not the perfect answer, but it's something small, like a spoonful of hope that connections in these times between individuals, something like we do today, for example, is very, very important to keep the process going. So connections instead of segregations is contributing to empathy.
Yeah, and your comments before about perspective taking and empathy, emotional and cognitive, were really important. I didn't get to talk as much about perspective taking and the development of empathy today, but developing empathy and compassion for the offender are some of the hardest units in the forgiveness model. And when we talk about perspective taking, we do it in two different ways. One way is helping children realize that everybody has a basic humanity because they exist as human beings. And we read the book, Let's Talk About Race, and it focuses on how if you take off your skin, everybody has the same bones underneath. And so one part of this perspective taking is the idea that we're very, even though we may be very different from the person who hurt us in certain ways, we're also very similar in the fact that we are all made up of bones. Take off our skin and we have the same bones underneath. We're all human beings. So that is one of the ways we focus on perspective taking. And the other is with expanding our view specifically of the offender. And after being hurt, we have a tendency to think about the person who hurt us only as the monster who hurt us. And when we expand our perspective, when we take off our blinders, we perhaps think about the person in greater complexity, in totality. If we happen to know them, we recall any positive interactions or characteristics that we know about them. If it's a stranger, it's harder to do that because then we might have to imagine, we may have to try to find out information, but we have to think about them in more complex ways as simply reducing them to the offender who hurt us. And that helps when we can do that, that then does help develop this empathy. And it's interesting when you're talking about empathy being effective. I have a student, I'm teaching a forgiveness class right now, and one of my students remarked that it's hard for her to get angry at the person who hurt her because she didn't want them to feel the pain that she felt about being injured. And so I just really thought that comment was interesting, that she didn't want to share her anger because she didn't want the person that hurt her to experience the pain that she was experiencing. So I thought that was interesting.
I think actually what I was going to ask you might link up to what you were just saying. I have to be honest, this isn't my field at all, so I'm just going to ask the question. What role does self-reflection have in the forgiveness process? So let me just rephrase that. What role does self-reflection have in the forgiveness process?
Thoughtful question. Thank you. The self-reflection process, as I teach college students about forgiveness, a lot of students comment that they have to forgive themselves, or self-forgiveness occurs before you can forgive another person. And I agree that it's important in a relationship to look at how you as an individual and may have contributed to the injury, or look at your part in it. And self-forgiveness, self-reflection is important. However, I like to emphasize that forgiveness occurs in the context of deep personal and unfair injury. And I think people often, they very generously talk about self-forgiveness or say they need to forgive themselves when they're forgiving another person. And I think it's important to remember that you forgive yourself if you committed a deep personal and unfair hurt. Maybe it's important to accept or your actions. So, for example, when I was working with incest survivors, a lot of the literature at that time, this was the early 90s, talked against forgiving the offender. They were very clear. You do not want to forgive the offender. That shouldn't happen. That's not going to lead to healing. But they talked about forgiveness of self. You should forgive yourself. And when I was reading that, it did not make sense to me. I was thinking, what does the child, what does the incest survivor need to forgive themselves for? Like, you can forgive yourself, but don't forgive the offender. And I'm thinking, what did they do wrong? I mean, I guess as an incest survivor, if they perpetrated the act against someone else, yes. In that way, they would need to forgive themselves. Would they need to forgive themselves for not telling anybody if the offender had said, I'm going to hurt you if you tell someone? I guess I would say acceptance is a better word than self-forgiveness. Do they need to forgive themselves if their body responded in a certain way? I would say acceptance. So I think we need to be careful when we talk about self-forgiveness, but I do think there are many occasions when we do need to forgive ourselves for, but we need to really think about what deep hurt we may have committed. But aside from self-forgiveness, self-reflection is important. It's important to know exactly the way we've been hurt, to understand that. And I don't think our society does a great job of helping individuals sit with their pain. And one of the reasons people have a hard time forgiving is because they have to be vulnerable. They have to recognize and admit that they were hurt. Some people don't want to identify that they were hurt because they're afraid that the relationship will end if they perhaps confront their offender, if they show their anger, so they may swallow and repress. But self-reflection is a very important part to really identify, acknowledge, admit that one was hurt. It's kind of like when you're looking on social media and you may be looking at Facebook and something makes you feel bad or you feel yucky inside. This happens to me. And then I have to take a minute and step back and say, what did I just see that caused me to feel bad? Like, was someone on vacation that I want to do? Was someone out and I wasn't out? Like, you don't necessarily understand it right away, but you do have to think about it for a few minutes and understand what made me feel bad. So I do think self-reflection is really important.
Thank you.
It's almost time for us to finish the day. Suzanne, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation, and Yonat for your amazing comments. You were looking for some optimistic ending, so not completely optimistic, but we did have a study in Israel. This is how I got to know Suzanne, actually, with fifth grade students, Arabs and Jewish, in the north of Israel. Leiki Sabanu is here, was the coordinator of the study. And the students and the teachers and the parents were just overwhelmed and excited about it. They were reluctant at first, but they learned so much from it and they changed so much, not only the students, but also the teachers and the parents. So, this is like a bubble of something good. Although I have to say, and maybe ruin the party, but I'm also afraid, after hearing the previous session, Suzanne, the previous session was about the situation of Arab, Palestinian, Israelis now in Israel. And it was devastating. And I'm afraid, or not afraid, I would like to end in an optimistic way, but forgiveness is an internal process. It shouldn't come as a replacement of fixing injustices and structural injustice.
Exactly.
Structural injustice has to be stopped through any way possible, not any way, but, non-violent measures. Forgiveness is not something that should silence those who see the injustice and want to change it. So I want to, for all of us to be cautious. Oh, yeah, we found the solution. Forgiveness will solve everything. The more structural injustices, this is something that is still on the table, but forgiveness gives
Yes.
hope. Suzanne, do you want to finish with the sentence? I think you do, so go ahead and, yeah.
Me? Oh, me? Oh,
Yes,
I
yes,
think
you.
that's.
Yes,
oh,
you.
Sorry, Tally, I think that's a great point, that forgiveness is not mutually exclusive with justice. And they both can coexist at the same time. Forgiveness does not replace. Forgiveness is personal way of healing, and justice needs to occur alongside forgiveness. So thank you for emphasizing that. And I hope that you could share the PowerPoint with others so I know I went through a lot of information in a short period of time, and I wasn't able to focus as much as I would have liked on some point. So if participants can receive the PowerPoint, there's some slide videos embedded in there they could watch at their leisure. And yeah, and thank you so much. I'm sorry I couldn't attend the other parts of the conference. It sounds like it was important.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yonat, for your important comments.